to some kind of a focus, it might be possible to review something interesting, which could turn out to be important. Let's focus for a minute and let everything else go and be unconcerned with everything else. And let's focus on this. Now notice that I haven't said anything. I've just opened up my hand. This is the problem. The problem is that our minds are habituated and conditioned to a language projection, mimesis of reality. And they do not see, they do not recognize, they do not respond to, they do not live in what we would consider real. But they are manipulated by, and they manipulate others in, a surrogate realm, which is purely imaginary, and only occasionally, through random juxtaposition, has anything real in it whatsoever. One of the most poignant philosophers of the 20th century came to the conclusion, his name was Jean-Paul Sartre, he came to the conclusion that outside of our ego, there is only a transcendental non-being. And he wrote a book called Being and Nothingness, which dominated thought after the Second World War. And his issue was never addressed. It was let slide in the late 1950s because Jean-Paul Sartre came out with a book on dialectical criticism of Marxism, and many people wrote him off as a French leftist. Why discuss such issues, especially when they're depressing? Because they lead directly to his conclusion, which, if not answered, becomes the existential dilemma. And that is, if our agreed to mimetic of reality is discounted, it leaves us absolutely nowhere. And that the only way to justify living is to consent to a surrogate illusionary world, to consent to be living in an illusion with others. And as long as we share the illusion, we should be at least content that we have this and not nothing. At the very core of this, which we don't have to go into today, and next year we'll go into a little bit when we get to history, at the core of this dilemma about language and reality, and in fact one of the books that we have now to deal with is called Myth and Reality, and the other one's called Language and Myth. So language and reality is exactly where we are today at Myth 9. Ernst Cassirer and Mircea Eliade. This is exactly where we are. We would like to understand something important about myth, because myth has been written off as that very consensually illusionary realm that is only there as an artifact of human fear in face of being confronted by absolute transcendental non-being, nothingness. The popular way to say it is that men and women agree to tell each other these stupid cycles of old hat, worn out myths, because without them we would have nothing exactly at all. The dilemma is posed most poignantly by Jean-Paul Sartre in Being and Nothingness in the section called The Whole. And he relates that at the very center of the psyche, if one takes the ego away, one finds a whole. Exact, transcendental non-being. And that the only thing that covers it up, the only thing that prevents us from falling through this hole into nothingness, is a net which is called the ego. And if we didn't have the ego, we would have exactly nothingness. The most poignant thinker of modern times, Hegel, about 200 years ago, in the Age of Revolution, about the time that Jefferson was working on building the United States, Hegel was working on this issue in philosophy. And he saw that the fulcrum upon which one either makes or breaks the ability to understand what's going on here in these issues is the question of time. Hegel uses a German term, fallen, which later is revised somewhat by a 20th century writer named Martin Heidegger as verfallen. And in a curious way, it has to do with what the English word fallen would mean. Hegel says that our pure spirit falls into time, and having fallen into time, it then lives out in terms of historical conditions a play of events. And that while there is, in terms of absolute precision, a spirit which could transcend above time and its events, there most likely is a shadow of that spirit which would be nothingness itself. For philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre, who came to suspect and disbelieve in any possibility of a spirit, there was only the shadow, the hole, left. And modern thought is left exactly there because the issue has never been answered. The question has never been addressed. It has been dismissed. And like some backed up, fetid backwater swamp, modern thought has become just that, a slimy swamp, dammed up at the very point of nothingness and time. It has something to do with those issues. And the key to this is understanding myth. Because in the most basic way, myth has to do with language. Without language, without someone telling a story, there's nothing to work with. Now, at the very end of Myth and Reality, Mircea Eliade, page 191, the section Survivals and Camouflages of Myths, Eliade, who's writing a number of years ago now, I think the first version of this was 1963, so this is 31 years ago. He writes, "What we consider important is the fact that in modern societies, the prose narrative, especially the novel, has taken the place of the recitation of myths in traditional and popular societies. More than this, it is possible to dissect out of the mythical structure of certain modern novels, in other words, to show the literary survival of great mythological themes and characters, that modern literature, especially the novel, are modern myths. We live in a time, 30 years later, where very few people read anymore. And when they read, they don't read with an eye towards hearing myths told. And in fact, cinema, film, has replaced the novel as the popular exchange milieu. And while there were at one time many films that had a mythic content, films today produced in 1994 do not have a mythic content so much. One can go to see any film that's showing and making big money today, and you will see that the films move by action, by pace of event, by special effects, and not by character and not by storyline. In other words, films are today visual arcade games. And the arcade game is a ritual regression falling back from the level at which mythology would operate. And so, in a way, the taste, the penchant, the habit, the addiction for arcade game entertainment is a pathological symptom of people who have degenerated away from even the mythic level, which is already, in understanding, a very early level in human capacity. The mythic level is very early. The only level that exists before the mythic is the ritual. And so by the mid-1990s, the consciousness of the popular individual has been reduced to bedrock, which may perhaps explain the popularity of reviving the Flintstones. Pardon my pun. What's really difficult about this, we're going to talk about today and get it out of the way so that we don't have to worry about it the rest of the time that we look at myth. Because we'd like to look at something interesting about myth, but what's getting in the way are these very issues, these very snags, which are relentless because they do not go away, they will not go away, they cannot go away. Once something has been raised in consciousness, because of the nature of consciousness being a field which carries a distributing energy matrix natural to its interplay, once a question has been raised, it slowly filters its way throughout the entire field of consciousness. One of the popular sayings from about 4 generations ago was to think good thoughts because bad thoughts go into circulation just as well as good thoughts. That all thoughts go into circulation, it's better to put good thoughts in circulation rather than bad thoughts. That thoughts have vibration, and negative vibes bring things down, and positive vibes raise things up. It was put in the popular way by my grandmother, born in Berlin in the last century. She used to say, "Don't frown too often because it may freeze on your face." It's a popular way of saying that what goes on in a person radiates out from them and affects everything around them, and that once one understands what consciousness is, a field of energy which distributes all aspects of it universally throughout the matrix, one frown will be distributed throughout the entire field of consciousness. And you say it doesn't make much of a difference, but how much of a difference is necessary to change the tone? As a yogi finds out very quickly, one bad thought not only ruins a day, but it can take years of meditation to work back in. The Mona Lisa smile on the meditating Buddha is not a nicety of iconographical artifact, it's a necessity. One of the problems here, and the way to hook this so that where our attention can come here, is to fill this open hand with the issue, the question of time. That it has something to do with time. What has to do with time? What is the it that has to do with time? The it is what Sartre called in the title of his book, being. Now, Sartre's book, Being and Nothingness, which came out, written during the Second World War and came out just after, was actually a programmatical development which was paired about 20 years before, in the mid to late 1920s, by a German book which also had being in its title, only instead of being and nothingness, that previous book in the 1920s by a philosopher named Martin Heidegger. Heidegger's book was called Being and Time. Sartre's book was called Being and Nothingness, Heidegger's book, Being and Time. And it's just like in our mythic selections, one book is called Myth and Reality, the other is called Language and Myth, so that myth in both titles is the arbiter between language and reality. And just so, being and time, being and nothingness, being as the idea is the mediator in between time and nothingness. So that when I hold an open hand and say nothing, the nothingness that is here in the open hand, that nothingness has no time. And the ego, which has fallen into time, shies away from that as if it were anathema to it. What the ego hates most, fears most, is transcendental exactness. The ego will do anything it can not to allow transcendental exactness to occur. With the saying that is almost a pastiche cliche now, is that we are our own worst enemy when it comes to trying to realize something. It is we who get in our way most, and not because we are clumsy, but because our ego is very adept at keeping itself in our way. And so the resistances are all versions, they are the costumes of the ego trying to keep us from realizing. And so, of course, in education, which is about self-realization, we'll pick, P-I-Q-U-E, will pick the ego most. And someone who gives in to the ego will not show up. They want nothing to do with that process. That's too much like spotlight time. It's going to show up not only shadows and pimples, but it's going to show up what's there. and the ego knows what's there, a provisional illusion which it needs to sustain. Otherwise, there's exactly and absolutely nothing. In Language and Myth, in Cassir's book, in the section, The Evolution, at the end of the evolution of religious ideas and language and conception is the next section, right, where the evolution of religious ideas and language and conception come together. There's this kind of concluding paragraph. The value of such observations for the general history of religions lies in the fact that here a dynamic concept of deity has taken the place of the static ones with which both are wont to operate, that the god or demon is not merely described according to his nature and significance, but that the law of his origin is taken into consideration. An attempt is made to spy out his genesis from the mythical religious consciousness, that is to say, that both gods and demons have an origin, they have a genesis, they have a development. An attempt is made to spy out his genesis from the mythical religious consciousness, in fact, to note the very hour of his birth. Notice here that in myth, gods have a birth. There's a whole mythology, there's a whole mythological area which concerns creation, the births of things, the creation of things, the creation of gods, the creation of demons. If in fact, the very note of the hour of his birth. If empirical science, in the realms of etymology, religion, and ethnology, if empirical science in these realms finds itself faced with problems of this sort, surely no one can deny philosophy the right to essay them and bring its own principles and interests to bear on their solution. And then he goes into language and conception and begins with this sentence. To know and understand the peculiar nature of mythical religious conception, that is to say, when we're starting to look at myth as myth, the idea of myth, and to look at it, at this conception of myth, what are we talking about? What are we looking at? To know and understand the peculiar nature of mythical religious conception, not only through its results, but through the very principle of its formation, and to see furthermore how the growth of linguistic concepts is related to that of religious ideas, and in what essential traits they coincide, this requires us indeed to reach far back into the past. We must not hesitate to take a roundabout way through general logic and epistemology, for it is only upon this basis that we may hope to determine precisely the function of this sort of ideation, and to distinguish it clearly from the conceptual forms which serve theoretical thinking. According to the traditional teachings of logic, the mind forms concepts by taking a certain number of objects which have common properties, in other words, coincide in certain respects, together in thought, abstracting from their differences so that only the similarities are retained and reflected upon. In this way, a general idea of such and such a class of objects is formed in consciousness. What is the man saying? Written in 1946, the same time that Sartre was writing and publishing Being and Nothingness. Cassir's Language and Myth is published at the very same time as Sartre's Being and Nothingness. They address, in a curiously almost paired way, the same issue. For is it not the stories which the ego tells to keep itself entertained and distracted, is that not mythology? Isn't that what's going on? Isn't it our egos that tell or listen to these stories? Isn't it the tapestry of myth that bridges the chasm of nothingness? Or is it? What is bound up here is that somehow we are not able to hear or to see or to say. We're not able somehow to get a handle on language. Whatever problems there are here for us, forbidding us to really get it, has to do with language. That in a kind of a ultimate way, language is really the issue. And that words, which are concepts in language like being, like time, like nothingness, are subsidiary to this more primordial concern about language. Let's put it into a question. What in the world is language? What's going on, really, when someone speaks and someone hears? What's happening? Casseur, in Language and Myth, says that there is a very peculiar kind of dichotomy that happens here in language. That one kind of language indeed is myth, but another kind of language related to myth, but remarkably different from it, is logic. Two kinds of language, myth and logic. When we say something like that, when we oppose logic to myth, when we say that someone is talking logically, we have a certain confidence and certainty in what they're saying. When we say that someone is talking mythically, we tend to dismiss that. That the mythic is somehow just somebody's ego jabbering. It's their version of the stories they tell. And what do those people know? African myths are good for Africans. Eskimo myths are good for Eskimos. They're not doing us any good. Unless we're African or Eskimo. Greek myths are for those guys way back then. Egyptian myths even further back. What has that got to do with us? Unless you're fantasizing that you're an ancient Egyptian or an ancient Greek. You might as well have Martian myths or myths from another star. Science fiction stories then are just as preferable as any kind of ancient myths, and isn't it all relative anyway? So that somehow logic is precise and myth is imprecise. Why is logic precise opposed to the imprecision of myth? The implication is that myth is imprecise. And in fact, myth is much more precise than logic. How did this topsy-turvy situation come to be? The term abstract is the trigger by which this whole issue is resolved. That somehow logic is an abstracted form, that the form of myth somehow in its abstracted skeleton is okay, but it's the content that's put into that abstracted skeleton that fleshes it out that is putrid. The bones are okay, but it's the mortal flesh that's added to those bones that stinks. We don't want their flesh on our bones. We don't want their myths on our logic. The logic is okay. What is the abstracted form of logic? The abstracted form of logic is always the line, the linearity, the train of thought, the line of reasoning, the line of argument. The methodological abstracted skeleton of a good logical progression is that it follows its line precisely, abstractly, and is not deterred nor changed by the content, so that if one puts algebraic quantifications onto an abstract methodological line of development, one should have precisely the vehicle by which truth could be expressed, if it could ever be expressed. This was the confidence of a large part of the world until 1927. It was really the unspoken arbiter, and especially since the 17th century, since the time of René Descartes, it was especially, if not produced as a universal maxim by those who were much more sophisticated than those still trundling off in their mythic childhoods. It was always assumed, it was always subsumed, and it was completely junked and scrapped. It was thrown out. It was shown to be fallacious in 1927, and by the early 1930s, it was shown conclusively by a man named Kurt Gödel to be a dead end. The last book ever written on this planet in that particular tradition respecting the certain coherencies of abstract linear form was Ludwig Wittgenstein, his philosophical investigations, which closed the book permanently on the subject. That the wisest thing that one could say in those terms was to keep quiet, to say nothing. That silence, nothingness, was the only certain conclusion that one could come to logically about life. And silent it has been now for almost 2 generations. No one has spoken with any wisdom on this planet at all, philosophically, in terms of any kind of logic for at least 2 generations. If you had been a super yogi holding a cupped hand to an ear on the top of Mount Everest, where Milarepa used to have his ashram, not on the top, but on the slopes, he would have not have heard a single sound, because no one has said one thing since that time. Part of the clearing up of this, part of the task of this, is a conscientious look at myth, face on, heads up, and to address in ourselves what it is that happens when language occurs. What happens when language occurs? If someone tells a myth, if a myth is unfolding, if we're reading or someone is telling, but especially telling a myth, it has to have a starting point. It has to have a middle. And it has to have an end. It has to have a storyline. You can't sell something that doesn't have a storyline. No one's going to listen to something that doesn't have a beginning, doesn't have an interesting development, and doesn't have an end. That form, beginning, middle, and end, was abstracted out of the mythic cycle of expression and made the paradigm for a logical form by a man named Aristotle. The beginning, the middle, and the end as a paradigm was called the syllogism. You have this premise, you have this extension, you have this conclusion. That's the paradigm for logical form. It was abstracted from myth. Now, it's a curious thing. It's a really curious thing. You could ask any 3-year-old at any time on this planet that if you squeeze an orange, what will you get? They will tell you orange juice. I know it sounds absolutely ridiculous. You cannot get apple juice out of an orange. You cannot get anything else other than orange juice out of an orange. If you squeeze myth, you're going to get myth juice. And it doesn't matter if you freeze it in nice little cubes in the mind. Logical form of the syllogism of the Aristotelian version is myth juice. It's mythic. Syllogistic logic is an abstract myth form. And when it degenerates just like any other mythology. It generates back into ritual arcade games. Which is what, the universities are today. The universities are highly complex ritual arcade games. Most degrees, I'm being generous, are certificates that you have learned to play their arcade game well enough to be able to design your own. And that's why nothing gets done. And life decays progressively for at least 2 generations now. There's no solution in sight as long as one keeps staying in that sandbox. It can go on for hundreds of years. It did once. It was called the Dark Ages. But not only did Europe have a Dark Ages, China had a Dark Ages they just woke out of just a generation ago. That lasted from the 1400s until the 1900s, to the 20th century. In terms of world navigation, the Chinese in 1430 sent ships, 60 ships carrying 500 men each to the shores of Africa, East Africa, to explore, just to explore. And then an edict came down that there were to be no more of these kinds of inventions, no more of these kinds of developments. And Chinese navigation within 1 generation went back to coastal canoes. And they never had what would be called a navy until our time, after that. In fact, all Chinese invention went into freeze-dry. Islamic civilization is still in the Middle Ages. They're still exactly where they were left when Cordoba was a beautiful place in southern Spain 900 years ago. We are in the same syndrome. We're spinning our wheels in the same way, and we can do it for 900 years. Easy. And putting tattoos on your shoulders and an earring on your ears is not going to change one iota the viciousness of that circle. What is necessary is for an insight to be integrated. All it takes is one insight to be integrated once. It only takes one flash, one spark of creativity to break the enchantment of that vicious spell forever. And once broken, we are free to go deeper, higher, profounder, more beautifully into life. We're going to come back after the break, but the term that we're going to look at, the language word that we're going to look at, is not abstract so much, but the original word that Aristotle uses, because we want to be able to see when it first happened what kind of language was operative. The word was theoria. Theoria. Out of which our English word theoretical comes. But there's another word that's related to theoretical that also is a translation for theoria. That word is contemplation. And there is a marked difference, even though they are so close together to be ordinarily indistinguishable. The difference between theory and contemplation is the difference between abstraction and transcendence. Transcendence leads to freedom. Abstraction leads to addiction to ritual decay eventually. The art world once thought that the school of abstract painting was the new advance in art. But abstract painting without a transcendental artist leads directly to, well, it did. It was called the Ashcan School. And art has not moved 1 inch from that place ever since. I expect the New York galleries still feature some variation of the arcade game called non-transcendental abstract art. Let's stop there. We'll come back to where we began, which is here. Notice that if we're just in our human mode, I don't have to say anything. I can just hold the hand out, and even though the hand is empty, the hand is there. If we were attentive listeners, I could just say some words leading up to and then not say the conclusive word, and there would be a space of receptivity in our mental attention. This frame, like a bracket, which would go around something, which would abstract something out and make it stand out. The word for this process is called eidetic. Eidetic process. One of the English language translations of this process is called bracketing. In other words, in order to highlight something, I would bracket it. I would eidetically present it. And the man who pioneered this kind of technique was named Edmund Husserl. This title's a little difficult to read. Let's get this one. Phenomenology and the Crisis of Philosophy, Edmund Husserl. And Edmund Husserl originally was an engineer an engineer who was very good at mathematics and who got interested in existential philosophy. He started reading Nietzsche, he started reading Kierkegaard, and he got interested in how Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and that kind of existential thought got to be very difficult to keep track of, and so he developed what he called phenomenology, a practical way to abstractly see what you were talking about by bracketing things, by making what he called an eidetic reduction. And he had two prize students, Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre. Holy philosophy, Batman. And his most important book was called The Phenomenology of Internal Time Consciousness. In other words, if we're talking about time and time is a problem, maybe time is the problem, maybe it's because it's our problem, maybe it's because it's our time, maybe there's something about internal time consciousness. What about trying to bracket and see phenomenologically what is internal time consciousness? Eidetically reduced, what is it? And of course, the ability to do this is extremely difficult, and that produces the crisis of philosophy. Heidegger and Husserl tried to answer that crisis by their books, Being and Time, Being and Nothingness. Now, one of the curious things is that the earlier book, Being and Time, Sein und Zeit, was never finished. Heidegger wrote the first part, and it was so exquisitely refined that you get an A+ just by being able to read it in philosophy courses. The best commentary on Heidegger's Being and Time is my old philosophy professor from the University of Wisconsin about 35 years ago, E.F. Kalin. And Kalin's commentary is the best commentary. Because Kalin, in a way, when he was younger, was a French dandy. He was into Jean-Paul Sartre, but very quickly he got into Merleau-Ponty, and Merleau-Ponty's development of phenomenology takes a very interesting kind of a turn. He doesn't go into Marxist leftist thought, but he goes into a sociologically very tight ideational criticism about human society, and that the problem with human society rests very much with the issues around violence and the lack of understanding because signals get crisscrossed, and that nonsense happens in communication, and that this is a serious problem that should philosophically be looked at, and that an eidetic philosophy of language, a phenomenological look at man, should be able to look at language as a communication leading directly to insights about the problem of violence and madness and political tyrannies in human life. And Merleau-Ponty, of course, is one of the, in English, most ignored and yet one of the most poignant of all the French thinkers. Merleau-Ponty is much deeper than Jean-Paul Sartre and much more effective than Martin Heidegger. But in Heidegger and Sartre, the problems, because they are somewhat flawed in a major way, the problems are highlighted, and so they're better to use as examples of what the problem is. Question: why did Heidegger not finish Sein und Zeit? He finished the first part in 1926, and he never finished it. One asks then, what was the rest of Sein und Zeit that he didn't finish? Or, conversely, what is the first part? And the first part of Sein und Zeit is a nice, diagrammatic, refined language in a kind of a Heideggerian Sanskrit hyphenated language of what being is, what time is, what nothingness is, and then the rest of the book was to take this nice diagram and put it into motion. And the problem is that when you put Heidegger's Sein und Zeit into motion, it falls apart instantly. It's like a very elaborate piece of pastry, sort of a Rube Goldberg piece of pastry that is fantastic, and one looks at it and wipes one's brow and says, how are we going to eat that? And as soon as you pick it up, it falls all over itself into a complete mash, and it's all over the floor, and it becomes a mess. The problem is that Heidegger's being and time, when put into temporality, falls apart. And being dogged about it, Heidegger got curious about two previous philosophers who had somehow dealt with time in a very creative way, Hegel and Nietzsche. And Heidegger wrote 4 books on Nietzsche, a 4-volume investigation to try and make sure, yes, did I read him right? And he wrote a book on Hegel. Yes, did I read him right? Yes. Well, then why does my parfait behave in such and such a way? And of course, for a long time, the issues of Heidegger's failure were ignored because he went the other way. Jean-Paul Sartre went to the leftist-leaning Marxist kind of thought, and Heidegger went to the right-leaning fascist kind of thought. Heidegger was a Nazi. And it's interesting that the two students of Husserl would go, one becoming a communist and the other becoming a fascist. Because that's exactly what happened to philosophic thought in the 20th century. It split off because it did not face the issue. But while philosophy did not face the issue, science did, especially physics. And it's to the physicists of 1926, 1927, that we have to go to find human beings who faced those problems squarely and answered them. And it's the physicists who answered them who were able to go on and make a new world. Whereas 20th century philosophy is a story of obscuration and cowardice in very fundamental ways. 20th century physics is a courageous story of human intelligence, of grit, of true grit, which is not quite finished yet, but almost. Because the problem, the issue of facing nothingness, which was faced squarely in 1927, in 1983 came to the penultimate resolution of that face-off. Because in 1983, what was discovered was the Z0 particle in nuclear physics. And it's the Z0 particle that makes possible polarity and pairedness in the physical world. Without the Z particle being 0, being completely neutral in charge, there is no way that reality would work. Because the W minus and the W plus particles that exist on the same horizon, the same energy level with the Z particle, would not be able to carry relational interactions so that anything could happen. And part of the real problem of Sein und Zeit, of being in time by Heidegger, is it has no Z0 particle so that the W particles, plus and minus, don't work, so that relationality doesn't work in Heidegger's world. If one wants to thumbtack up on the bulletin board of history a final condemnation of the Nazis, it's that their philosophy doesn't work. Regardless of its horrendousness and distaste and disgust and all the rest of the list, the number one thing that one would say to them, it doesn't work. So why bother? Why it doesn't work has to do with mythology. Because mythology does work. One of the peculiar things about human life is that a lot of the beauty of human life is there because mythology works. The whole development of the romance of life is that people talking together get to like each other, because the mythic horizon, in a way, allows for secret and subtle relationalities to interchange, so that as one speaks a language, as one tells a myth to another, or two people share hearing a myth together, there's a bonding that happens between them. And it's that bonding that makes children of little ones anneal to the parents. It allows for the generational flow of human life. And without that bonding, each generation is completely a different block from another, and there's no flow in between them. And that's part of the problem. The whole phenomenon of gangs is that families don't work. The whole problem of wars is that nations don't work. It's as simple as that, but it's also as subtle as that. And the basic issue is one has to understand in a very basic way how myth works. It's indispensable to simply understand how myth works and not to forget it. Let's come back to what we said this morning. We're talking about Ernst Cassirer, one of our books, Language and Myth. Talking about myth versus logic. Talked about how logic, we could derive the word from the Greek word logos, but it isn't. Logic as a methodological form does not come from logos. Philo's kind of logical pattern comes from logos. Jesus's pattern of comprehensibility comes from logos, the word. But logic doesn't come from that. Logic comes from this abstraction of form from myth by theory, so that one has the syllogistic form. And from this procedure, we need to keep in mind the first little string to tie around the first little finger, that abstraction is a perilous process. Abstraction is a perilous process. And especially if you're abstracting from myth and you build logical form upon the axiomatic basis of abstraction from myth, not understanding what myth is, not being able to do myth, Aristotle created some very, very deep sandpits on the fairways of life. So much so that my old pal A.E. Van Vogt wrote 3 science fiction novels based on the world of null-A, the world of non-Aristotelian thought. Developed a lot from Alfred Korzybski. Science and Sanity was his book, all about how people make a very basic confusion. Korzybski used a phrase in Science and Sanity. He said, the map is not the territory. When the astronauts went to the moon with the Apollo program, the very first thing that each one of them and that all of them together learned was that the maps of the moon don't do you any good when you're on the surface. The horizon is too short, and because there's no atmosphere, everything is brilliantly clear, and there's no way to judge distance. There are no landmarks, and the surface curves too soon for Earth perspective, and you are lost completely. And if you try to remember where you are in terms of a map, you're not going to see anything at all. And the first thing that they did is they learned to stop looking at the maps in their mind and to start looking at the landscape where they were. And it took them about an hour to make a very basic shift. That in order to get from here to there, you can do it by lines of sight, and you can slowly build up a geography in your experience. So that, for instance, on Apollo 15, when Jim Irwin and Dave Scott on Lunar Rover 1 first drove out of sight of the Falcon, they were the first Earthmen to ever drive not only away from the Earth and everybody else, but drive out of sight of their only vehicle. They were the first human beings to ever be immersed 100% in an alien environment, another world. They experienced elation and not fear. And even though Houston Control was experiencing fear and saying to them, you better watch yourselves, you're out of sight of the Falcon, maybe if anything happens to Lunar Rover, are you going to be able to get back? They wanted to go and explore, because they had made a very basic human shift, which we all can make, by remembering the map is not the territory. You don't need to get lost. If you really are where you are, there's a certain subtle, secret relationality that builds up by experience. And if you put it into a feminine, philosophical language, it's that feeling and form are intelligent related. Feeling and form are intelligently related. In other words, feeling is intelligent about form. One builds up an acquaintance with gestalts from scratch, so that a whole new definition of rationality emerges. The definition of rationality, which Stephen Tolman first put into a book called Human Understanding, 1966. It's the first part of Human Understanding. He never wrote the other parts, not for Heidegger's reasons, not that it fell apart. He writes in here that the old definition of rationality is somewhat suspect, and that we're going to have to change. We're going to have a different definition. His new definition is that rationality is not remembering old laws and applying them to new circumstances, but to build up from scratch a relationality which allows us to develop an original orientation from the actual experience that we're having. This is the most important development. This particular critique that Tolman is writing, Human Understanding, is a criticism of John Locke and his work in empiricism, and David Hume and his book on human understanding. Hume and Locke, being empiricists, were the first critical generation to put what had become rationalist philosophy into its paradigm, rationalist philosophy being Cartesian. René Descartes. Whereas Descartes was a rationalist, he went to a mental map. And someone who went along that same way was someone like Spinoza. So when one opens up Spinoza's Ethics, one finds it written like a book on geometry. Axioms, postulates, examples. So rationalists viewed the world as a geometric construct. And as long as the abstract laws of geometry hold, then the geometric construct should also hold. And everything should be rationally logical. Very Aristotelian. Very Cartesian. One of Husserl's great little books is called Cartesian Meditations. It all hangs together, it holds together. But the British empiricists, like Berkeley and Locke and Hume, criticized this. They said, what is rational is the actual experience that happens. But they did not take experience to be myth, they shunned myth. John Locke believing in mythology? Never. They said experience is the actual experiment of what is now happening. In a way, it was like their phenomenological reduction. Only their phenomenological reduction, being a critique of the rationalists, did not reject the rationalists on a fundamental level. They just said the abstract methodology is applied to empirical procedure and not to mental geometrical diagrammation. So instead of mental diagrams along a geometrical line, one has diagrams along the line of actual experiment. Empirical process. In our time, someone like Stephen Tolman criticizes Locke for this. Criticizes then indirectly the whole empirical outlook. And Tolman is writing this some 50 years after Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, Kurt Gödel. He's late in the game. One cannot expect a map to be the territory, no matter how you draw the map. And by thinking that empirical maps are superior to rational maps is a fundamental error. In fact, it was such a fundamental error that it was detected very early on. The very first person to write a critique of Locke and Hume was Leibniz, who wrote it when Locke and Hume were still alive. In Leibniz's book, which is called New Essays on Human Understanding, was unpublished in his time because no one believed him. This is the first publication of Leibniz's New Essays on Human Understanding, and this is almost 300 years after he wrote it. It lay on dusty shelves in a minor court library in Germany, northern Germany, for 300 years, unread, unnoticed, not participating in the development of thought. So that Leibniz and Tolman, in their critiques of human understanding, even though they're separated by about almost 300 years, raise the same point, the same issue, but it's an issue, it's a point that is more poignantly raised in the development of 20th century physics. The point being this: if you do not understand how myth works, and you think that logic is an abstract certainty superior to myth, even though it's abstracted from myth, you will not ever understand that you're just using orange juice instead of the orange. And because you didn't understand how myth works, you certainly are not understanding how the abstraction from that, your logic, works. For a logic to be effective, you have to have the beginning, the middle, and the end all on the same line. The middle has to come from the beginning, and the end has to be consistent with the beginning and the middle. It's the same thing as in myth of saying that if you start to tell a story about Jane, you can't end with a story about Joe. That doesn't make a good story. So what makes a good language story, what makes a good myth, is the consistency of the storyline. Just as in logic, the argument is sound and valid if the linearity of the argument is developed. Tolman wrote a book called The Uses of Argument, which is an excellent way to learn how to use argumentation and that kind of logic. What emerges in the 1920s, the late 1920s, is the realization that there is no way for a logic to be so expansive that it can talk intelligently about a number of things without having an axiomatic base which is unable to define its own terms. In other words, for a logic to be large enough to be workable, that you could use it to say something meaningful about anything, you need a secondary logic to define the axioms of the first. And one gets into a problem which is there, which is related to questioning. And the problem is drawn out by Kalin in his beautiful exposition of Heidegger's Being and Time. Because usually, if you have this kind of a condition, where you have a circle of language which says something, and you cannot define your terms of that circle unless you go to another circle, or if you're trapped in that circle, you have two kinds of things that go wrong. One, if you're trapped in the circle and you try to make it self-consistent and yet it can't be, that's called viciousness. Whereas if you have to go to a second circle outside, you get into an infinite regression. Heidegger's problem was one that seemed to be that he was trapped in a vicious circle when actually he was trapped in a regression. Kalin is one of the few to point out that the problem is not that of viciousness. Vicious not being that it's mean, but viciousness in that the circle goes round and round and round without relief. It doesn't go anywhere. It's like a wheel that doesn't go anywhere. It's like a language that doesn't do anything in life. Somebody who goes on and on and on but doesn't say anything. That's what would make it logically vicious. Kalin writes this. He used to wear these big bow ties with polka dots and hair combed back. Occasionally he would throw pieces of chalk across the room when he couldn't quite get the idea right. He was torrential. Great live show. There are two reasons not to consider the circularity of ontological investigation as logically vicious. Now, ontological simply means it deals with being. When you're trying to think about being, you're trying to investigate being, and you're thinking about the language that you're using in talking about being, if it goes round and round and doesn't go anywhere, it's then logically vicious. He's saying Heidegger's thought, which is like an ultimate modern-day version of the ultimate abstractedness, which does not transcend. One of the stalest things about Nazi thought is its putrid abstractiveness and its lack of any spiritual transcendence whatsoever. Is truly mucking about in shadows that have no objects to go with them. First, asking the question does not ground something in the sense of deducing it from the question itself. In other words, he's saying asking questions about the process of questioning does not make questioning as a procedure logically vicious. The very fact that we're just asking questions about what it means to question doesn't involve us in a logically vicious circle. First, asking the question does not ground something in the sense of deducing it from the question itself. That is, it's not a question-begging demonstration. In philosophy, they say something begs the question when it doesn't address the issue. Indeed, phenomenological ontology demonstrates nothing in the usual logical sense of the term. Asking the question of their being, of beings, is the preliminary step for laying bare the grounds of their existence, which are to be exhibited through the analysis of the conditions necessary for their being or becoming whatever they are. It was for this reason that Heidegger began his inquiry with the data of his own being. Nothing was invoked there that did not concern the fact that wondering about one's existence is one way to exist, and finding answers to the questions deriving from human wonder is another way to exist. Now notice, in a very peculiar way, myth is all about the wonder about existence. Only myth, in a way, has a bleeding together of the questions and answers. A lot of myths and mythology are myths about natural events. Why is there a rainbow? What is the ocean? What is the moon? So there are myths about the rainbow, myths about the ocean, myths about the moon. That the question and answer to that question, which in abstract logical thought are quite separate and distinct, in mythology they are bled together so that one influences the other, which is the way it should be. Makes it intelligible. So in the mythic mode, we never ask questions that we are not already intuiting the answers to. The questions are already somewhat shaped by the intuitive answers that we have. And the intuitive answers that we have are somewhat shaped by the intuitive questions that are just beginning to come up. So that in a way, the intelligibility of myth is because there is a fabric of feeling where questions and answers are intimately part of each other. This is what makes mythology so satisfying. Mythology extremely satisfying. It is so satisfying that it makes a stable level of human life called culture. If a population of people have a shared mythology, which they are comfortable in, the culture, the way they live out that mythology in their life, will be stable for thousands of years, if not for tens of thousands of years, who knows? As long as it is not disrupted from within or by contact with other cultures from without, that culture will be stable. And there are ways to abstract that culture out of its geographical setting, out of its temporal setting, so that it sustains itself. An example is, for instance, Judaism. Judaism sustains itself whether it's in Argentina or in Poland or in Chicago. It doesn't make any difference whatsoever what the geography is. But it shares a mythology with other Jews of all those geographically diverse locations. One can be an American in Paris. One can be an American in Kyoto. The stability of a culture is extremely famous, but it is totally related to the integrity of the mythic flow, of the mythic horizon of language having its flow. As long as the cycle of a mythology is intact and not fractured, the culture which is the living out of that will be stable. No doubt whatsoever. The problem in the modern world is that there isn't an isolated culture left. Cultures are mixed into conjunction not only with each other, but mixed in terms of dozens and dozens of other cultures. It isn't just one culture being impinged by one other, but all cultures are impinged by many others. So that the problem was always seen in Aristotelian terms as abstracting the essence of a myth, or in this case abstracting the essence of a culture, and then making an abstract myth or an abstract culture which would preserve it from the vicissitudes of this battle with other cultures. In a way, the most successful abstract culture was Judaism. So when the Nazis came along to build an abstract culture which would allow them to get away from the mix and uncertainty of history so that they could come to the 1,000-year Reich or the infinite Reich, the number one abstract culture that was in their way was Judaism. It was the only competition that they could see that they could not deal with. They could deal with other peoples, other cultures, because those cultures were more or less still dependent upon geographical location. Italians are Italians in Italy, and if they're in the United States, they tend to be still in Italian families or Italian enclaves up until very recently. If Frenchmen are not in France, they tend to be still in a French kind of a culture. But Judaism was the number one abstracted culture, and an abstracted culture is called an ideology. And it got in the way. So that there is a whole kind of interplay here going on in the 20th century, at the core of which is the issue of mythology. And the simplest way to say it is that that core, that problem of mythology, and it is a problem, concerns the relationalities, the subtle, secret relationalities that come between people in terms of a shared language. It's sometimes put into terms of communication that our problem is a problem of communication. It's not a problem of communication. the popular guru of the early 1970s, Chogyam Trungpa, once in a lecture said, we think that people fight because they don't understand each other. But the actual fact is they fight because they do understand each other. That's why they fight. It's not a problem of communication. They're communicating very well. We hear you, we don't like you. The problem is one that, if I can use this term, the problem inhabits the mythic horizon of life because that's its familiar realm. The problem is with relationality, and that relationality always has to do with a ratio, and that this ratio, I used to call it the ratio of the real. But this ratio was singled out in the 1920s by another philosopher, not by Heidegger, not by Husserl, not by Sartre, not by Heisenberg. All these are Germans. But it was a Frenchman who singled it out. His name was Henri Bergson. And Henri Bergson, in a book called Creative Evolution, in a section called Intelligence and Instinct, put his mental finger exactly on the issue. Relationality has to do with a ratio, and this ratio has to do with two components that come together and make a kind of an interesting fraction, an interesting ratio. What are they? His ratio is between image and action. Image and action. Image or representation. An image is a mental representation. And the phrase, the very simple phrase that translates into English is, representation is stopped by action. It's one of the greatest phrases in Western thought. Representation stops when one does something. The very knack of being a Zen master is that one does not image something, but one has the image of action. Instead of having the image of the rock, one just has rock. One just has the being with the rock. Representation is stopped up by action. The proof of this is that if the accomplishment of an act is arrested or thwarted by an obstacle, consciousness may reappear. It was there, but neutralized by the action which fulfilled and thereby filled the representation. The obstacle creates nothing positive. It simply makes a void, removes a stopper. This inadequacy of act to representation is precisely what we here call consciousness. So that later on, from this point of view, the consciousness of a living being may be defined as an arithmetical difference between potential and real activity. It measures the interval between representation and action. Very powerful. Very powerful. And the people who were listening to Henri Bergson were the mythographers of the time, the writers, especially the novelists. The first one to get him was Marcel Proust, then very rapidly William Faulkner, Virginia Woolf, and dozens of others. We'll come back.